We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and again, we're going to be talking about a lot of different issues. Next hour, we'll have Jeff Myers with us. Dr. Jeff Myers has written this book, Should Christians Support Israel? You might remember yesterday when we were talking with Gary Frazier, we tried to give you some maybe prophetic perspective on that. What about just the political, biblical worldview perspective? And so we'll talk about that with him. In studio, as I've been talking about yesterday, we have Liberty McArtor with us, and again, she is the host of the Know Why podcast, also a writer here at Point of View. And we're going to get into a couple of issues in this first segment because I think we want to help you know more about how to exercise discernment. But first of all, Liberty, we've heard over the last few days that this strike by Israel, the strike by the United States of Iran, following up the strikes by Israel, is something that was a disaster because of a leaked Defense Intelligence Agency assessment, but it was one that was given low confidence, and it showed up in first the New York Times and then, of course, has been promoted by CNN. But my argument has oftentimes been, when you first hear that coming out, maybe you need to wait a little bit longer before you check it out and assume that it's correct.
Absolutely, and I'm happy to be here today, Kerby, but I saw that headline in the New York Times when it was first published, and I just had a little bit of pause because you know that, you can suspect that maybe the New York Times is eager to publish a kind of leak that would have a negative spin on things like that. And even in Proverbs, it says, the first man to state his case seems correct until the other side makes their case. And I think that's what is so needed in this time. There are enough voices that are just spitting out information every few seconds, but we need to wait, gather the facts, have discernment, and then be able to speak the truth. And in the long term, that's much more valuable. And now we are seeing more information and more perspective come out on that leak.
Matter of fact, we've got two articles, and I'm going to mention two others we haven't posted, so there's a lot more to find. One by James Lynch, but think about this for just a minute, because Proverbs does talk about the idea that that's why we have people cross-examine, that's why we wait. I was already getting a little bit of pressure, Liberty, from some individuals on Wednesday saying, well, what about the CNN report? And I just sort of said at the time, well, we don't have anything other than what was surfaced as a low confidence intelligent assessment. Number two, if this was done by an individual in the intelligence agency, which was the Defense Intelligence Agency, can I remind you that at least 51 individuals in the intelligence services were the ones that signed a letter saying they were pretty much convinced that Hunter Biden's laptop was something of Russian disinformation. And that turned out not to be the truth. So in some respects, what I'm trying to teach people, and we'll talk about this in just a minute with a very good piece also by Jonah Goldberg, is how to exercise discernment. And part of that is something I talked about today in another talk show, and that is the need for us to have low time preference. High time preference is, okay, I put it in the microwave and I'm just tapping my finger and saying, when is it going to come out? We have a news cycle and we've got to come up with an answer right now. And my answer to that sometimes is no. I think sometimes just sitting back, waiting and thinking and evaluating and gathering more information is a better way to go, don't you think?
It is, but it's a lost skill. And I think looking at the topics that you've prepared for today, this is going to be a recurring theme throughout the show. But there's a whole generation that really hasn't been trained to follow a thought process all the way to its conclusion because our attention spans are so short. And we do have a minute-by-minute news cycle that people feel pressured to speak about a headline or an issue as soon as they learn about it. But even now, I saw a video from Pete Hegseth earlier explaining things from that same report that was leaked that casts a different perspective too. So it was selectively quoted and leaked to the media. And again, that's the kind of perspective that you will get if you wait and are patient to get all the information first.
Well, let's work our way through a few of those. You've got those on your computer. I'm one of those old school people that has it on pieces of paper, but nevertheless, numerous outlets did report that this particular low confidence assessment from the Defense Intelligence Agency question whether or not the strike was effective. And yet I love Caroline Leavitt, who is the press secretary, says everyone knows what happens when you drop 14 30,000-pound bombs perfectly on their targets, total obliteration. But then you have, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, saying there's no way Iran comes to the table if something and somehow nothing happened. This was complete and total obliteration. And then, of course, you mentioned Pete Hegseth. We've got that quote there as well. But what I find so interesting is that you even have Donald Trump making the case that, this was a very significant strike. But if nothing else, I'll be the first to acknowledge, as I've said before, for some of our younger listeners, they may not be familiar with the fact that sometimes presidents have lied. And I said yesterday, just go to Wikipedia and look up Gulf of Tonkin resolution. That was one. Or more recently, you can talk about, do we have weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And so sometimes, and we know this president sometimes exaggerates a little bit, but as we go through this, I think, Liberty, we've got pretty good evidence that not just the president, not just some of the people in the cabinet, but people in Israel and people even with the UN Atomic Energy Commission are all saying, yeah, this is exactly what we thought it was.
And when you reference the UN, that as Hegseth pointed out in his press conference, that's not an organization that's necessarily always friendly to the United States or certainly Israel. So there are a lot of sources to consider. And another thing, too, is just the fact that it is probably going to take at weeks, at the minimum, to really understand the full extent of the damage. And I think that, other intelligence teams around the world understand that. And so this was a, preliminary report just released a few days later. So we can expect, and it was for internal purposes as well, as they are gathering information. So it wasn't meant to be the final report on that. And so, waiting for all the information to come out and being patient with that.
Let me pick up on that point, too, and then we'll take a break. And that is that our article by Noah Rothman, which you can read as well, points out that, first of all, just the first report isn't necessarily the most accurate. We found that from some of the news reports of riots and things of that nature, because this particular news product, or what they call raw product, that comes from one defense agency, which was the Defense Intelligence Agency, would be then synthesized with products produced by America's 17 other intelligence agencies. And one of the others that is not included is Israel. And they do have boots on the ground. Israelis have a sophisticated intelligence network throughout Iran, and they have human sources on the ground. And so far, they have concluded that there was extremely severe damage and destruction that took place. And so, again, you can see that in the second article we've provided for you, that is the case. When we come back, though, let me just pick up one or two other points, some comments by Marco Rubio, as well as some comments from the UN Atomic Energy Watchdog, and give you some of those quotes because, again, you deserve the answers. And if you say, okay, I've had some people saying, well, it was a failure, or even if they say it was a success, well, why should I trust Trump? Okay, well, let's see if we can trust some other people and put some other facts on the table. And we'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
For decades, the left has been willing to redefine terms to win a debate and convince the public of their views. Tomorrow, I will provide some examples of that linguistic sleight of hand, but today I want to talk about a new strategy. Leftists claim the word woke and wokeness cannot be defined since so many politicians and commentators are using the terms in a negative way. Are some people using the term woke without understanding what it means? That's inevitable in a world where people are misusing terms like racism and white supremacy as epithets. To counter some of the misunderstanding, I devote the beginning section of my book, A Biblical Point of View on Wokeness, to explain what woke is not. You can find a complete list in the book, Christianity and Wokeness by Owen Strachan. Defining what woke isn't difficult. Wilfred Riley recently wrote How to Define Woke. He says that the woke person or the social justice warrior is someone who believes that, number one, the institutions of American society are currently and intentionally set up to oppress minorities, women, and the poor. Number two, virtually all gaps in performance between large groups prove that this oppression exists. And number three, the solution to this is equity, which means proportional representation regardless of performance or qualifications. He also provides an excellent definition of woke from James Lindsay, who I've quoted in previous commentaries. Riley also explains that these definitions are not ones that conservative authors have created. Essentially, they are merely summaries of the writings of leftists who have been promoting wokeness and critical theory for the last few decades. He concludes by noting that sometimes woke policies can be complex to discuss, but they aren't hard to define. Don't stop using a word that is accurate and descriptive. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to spend just a few more minutes talking about this, and then, as you know, we are coming to the very end of our fiscal year end, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Liberty McArtor with us, and we're talking about one of the articles I didn't post, but that's okay because it's certainly easy to find, and that is Secretary of State Marco Rubio was on with those people at Politico. Now, Politico is kind of left of center. Deja Burns was asking some questions, and I love what he said. He says, look, what typically happens is someone reads a report and leaks it with their own spin, often to embarrass the administration or to oppose the action. The Iranian program and the nuclear program today looks nothing like it did a week ago, which is fair to say. And then you have some of the other things in which she was saying as well that some of the evidence is open source. He talks about some of the images that we have as well. And he says, of course, you could rebuild it, but right now it's unusable. When you look at one of the others, the Al Natanz area, the Israelis caused heavy damage. And then, of course, the one deep under the mountain, the Fordo one, we believe had significant lasting damage. And he talks about dropping 12 munitions. And, of course, we've had 14 of those bunker busters being dropped. So to make the argument that this was not successful, I think doesn't really square with reality. And it's just a reminder that, as we showed in one of these articles by our friend Noah Rothman, Trump has an intelligence problem, and that is there may be some left over in the past that don't want him to succeed. He's brought in his new group, and they may be too enthusiastic. You know, sometimes one of the reasons dictators are not successful is everybody tells them what they want to know. So it's always helpful to get people that agree with you and people that disagree with you. And I think Marco Rubio is saying just because you have one report, don't jump to these conclusions that everybody in CNN seem to be jumping to.
Yes, and, you know, the part about whenever somebody might see something and then, release part of it or leak part of it or put their own spin on it, and that's just devoid of the full truth, the full picture. So again, I think something that you often say is it's okay to say, I don't know. And in a situation like this, we're really not going to know the full ramifications of this action for a long time. But as Rubio pointed out, you wouldn't have had the success that you've already had with Iran coming to the table, and then you do have a ceasefire, at least for now. I don't think that would have been happening if it was completely unsuccessful. So I think we can look at a little bit of evidence that we already have.
I think so. Not exactly pinprick. Let's, if we can, real quickly get to one other issue, and then I do want to talk about the fact that we're coming to the end of our fiscal year, and that is some people say, okay, what about those people that actually look at this every single day? The watchdog for the U.S. and UN atomic energy, and this one for the UN, which would be the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's the IAEA. I sometimes say IEA, and I'm sure people go, oh, what does that stand for? International Atomic Energy Agency. The director is Rafael Grossi, and he says, our assessment is there have been some localized radioactive as well as chemical release within the affected facilities. So some people wondered, were there any leaks? But also, it's also his assessment as well that there's no off-site radiation levels. So the concern about there being any radiation leaks is there. And he says, again, it's very clear that we no longer have a nuclear Iran, basically describing it as the difference between night and day. So that comes from the IAEA. You might say, well, got any others? We got one more, and then we'll call it quits. David Albright of the Institute for Science and International Security says he has determined that the U.S. and Israeli strikes effectively destroyed Iran's centrifuge enrichment program. Goes on to say it's going to be a long time before they have any kind of capability. And later we'll talk about this very good piece by Jonah Goldberg. Can we get to the point of non-proliferation? So certainly those are some issues I wanted to put on the table. But let's, if we can, for just a minute, recognize that we're coming to the end of our fiscal year. And so, Liberty, we're also joined by an individual that is the Vice President of Stewardship. That's Jana Weidler. And Jana, we have been, over the last couple of days, encouraging people to give, but how are we doing?
Kerby, we are not doing as well as we want to be doing. We had a matching challenge of almost $7,000 on the table, and we still have $60,000 to go to be matched. So right now, if you give to Point of View, your donation, your gift will be matched. It'll be doubled in value for us. So if you're thinking about it right now, I'd like you to encourage you to stop what you're doing and pick up the phone or go to pointofview.net, and there's a big, huge donation button there. Or you can call 1-800-347-5151. And I want to point out a Bible verse, Luke 6:38 says, "Give, and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. For with the measured use will be measured to you." So we always want to encourage people to tithe to their church first and then pray about where God would have you give. And we appreciate every gift we've gotten so far. We've gotten calls from all over the U.S., and a number of the gifts have been small but very generous, and we know that God will multiply those.
Well, again, we thank you for the gifts that have come in, but we certainly have a need, as you've heard her say. If you've been saying, well, I want to make sure my dollar-for-dollar match is still on the table, it is, because we're only 12% into it right now, so that is good. But Liberty, one of the things we do from time to time, send out an email, and you wrote this one and asked some good questions. Why are Israel and Palestine at war? And I'm thinking, well, we're going to sort of answer that today with Jeff Myers, aren't we? You have another one. What's so bad about the abortion pill? Well, I'm looking at your booklet here on a biblical point of view on chemical abortion. A little bit later, how can I stop feeling so anxious all the time? I believe that is your latest Know Why podcast, isn't it? So if people are saying, well, what am I supporting? You're supporting answering all the questions you put in this email.
So one of the things that I appreciate about Point of View as a listener and someone who listened when I was growing growing up, is that every difficult issue, an issue that is relevant that people are dealing with in their lives. It's something that you address, Kerby, and so now that I'm on the team, I'm so blessed to be able to help do that as well. But applying biblical truth to these issues, and as somebody who writes a lot of our materials, I see the testimonials that come in, and it's just amazing if people will write letters or notes to Point of View saying, you helped me talk about this with my adult child or with my grandchild or with my neighbors, and I'm actually able to discuss these issues or understand them from a biblical perspective because they feel equipped by Point of View. So it's not just a news program. You really are equipping people with how to address these issues from a biblical perspective.
One of the quotes here from somebody in Michigan, and China, you've been with me in Michigan. Your program enables me to have conversations with other people, both Christians and non-Christians, on topics I otherwise might not be able to discuss otherwise. And so, again, we are asking for your financial support, and the challenge that we have right now and the particular goal that we have that Warren Kelly gave is not just picked out of the air. It's one that will allow us to continue bringing these programs every single day.
That's right. And we do have a very small staff. I've mentioned that many times. We have 10 employees and one of them is part-time. We do a lot with very little, and we use discernment to use these gifts and multiply every penny we get to get the best outcome. So we're getting the booklets, the monthly booklets, the magazine out every month. Everything that happens here on a daily basis is done by very few people. So we need your help.
And again, one of the things I've talked about is here is the latest, for those of you watching online, Outlook, and it's all about what has happened in the Middle East. And you turn to this one, it talks about the axis of evil. You would think we wrote that a week ago, and as Liberty knows, we wrote this months ago. Of course, you have your article in there as well on tariffs, and then we also have one by Gary Bauer, who will be with us on Monday in terms of restoring respect for America. So this is just one of the many benefits that you get. Of course, we oftentimes talk of our booklets, the most recent one here on Sharia law, which again is something very related. So if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to help you, and I would certainly benefit from some of this information, that's one of the things we want to put in your hands. So as we go to a break, this would be a perfect time to call. Jana just gave you that number. It's 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. I know I have my wife, my daughter, and others coming in tomorrow to answer the phone, but we still have enough people, I think, right now to answer the phone. So if you have been waiting till the last day, it's kind of like the second last day, nevertheless, time is a-wasting, and there is an opportunity still because there is a match on the table. So if you can help us out, give us a call, 800-347-5151. At any time, of course, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Well, I do need to say that we are running out of time to raise funds by June 30th, the deadline that will determine our budget for the next fiscal year. Your gift will make a difference. And thanks to an ongoing matching challenge, your gift will be doubled through the month of June. Here's why Point of View is the media ministry to support as we forge into the future. Point of View is trustworthy, with proven dedication to a biblical worldview for 53 years and counting. Additionally, Point of View is making a multi-generational impact. Your support equips listeners to articulate biblical truth about the issues of our day with their children and even their grandchildren. Americans need a proven resource to equip current and future generations to live out God's truth in our time. Give it to them today by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Liberty McArtor in studio with us. A little bit later, we're going to be talking with Dr. Jeff Myers. Should Christians support Israel? But one of the other articles I wanted to point you to comes from Jonah Goldberg. It's been a while since we've had him on the program, and we'd love to get him on again. But his article is This is What Non-Proliferation Looks Like. Now, I do want to get into the details, but Liberty, one of the things I appreciate him saying very early on in his piece is when events are moving fast, it sometimes makes more sense to talk about how to think about the events rather than what to think. And as you mentioned just a minute ago, I think that's a theme. We really want people to know how to think about these issues. Jeff Myers, of course, does that with their Summit Ministries. We do that here on Point of View. We do it at the Mind Games Camp, which you just had recently. These are ways in which even if you don't have one of my booklets or one of these commentaries, or you don't have access to somebody who maybe has approached you with an issue, learning how to think about these issues is really key. And that's one of the things we want to train people to do here on Point of View.
And I think, you do such a good job at that, Kerby. And one of the things that I appreciated about the article was that as well. And I think part of learning to think through things in a productive way is being okay with not knowing everything. And today, so many people, and I think young people fall prey to this, they feel pressured to have an opinion or a take right away because they don't want to be on the wrong side. They don't want to be canceled. I think this is a fear among young people.
Yes.
But you say, okay, what facts do we have? What information do we have? Let's make the best judgment based on that. And then it's okay to acknowledge what we don't know and that we might learn more along the way. And he really just does a great job in this article of laying that out and kind of giving us some guideposts for how we can think about that particular to this situation.
And again, one of the things he says early on is I think everyone should make peace with the fact that we don't know whether Trump's strike on Iran was successful for a while, whether it obliterated the program or barely nicked it. He gives us all that. But even apart from that, what's the next step? Now, since I always prepare a day ahead of time, I know one of the articles I've posted for tomorrow, which Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford will be talking about, is I actually let you see what the supreme leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Khamenei, has been saying. And he's actually been telling his people that they've destroyed Israel, they've destroyed the United States, that the attack on Iran was insignificant, which shows me that they're sort of digging in their heels, because some people have thought, well, once you've destroyed the possibility of enriching uranium, maybe rational people, and that's not necessarily what you find in Iran right now, but rational people would say, well, maybe we just need to stop trying to do that. But nevertheless, it looks like if they don't go back to wanting to rebuild that sometime in the future, and it will take years. They've also lost a lot of the equipment, a lot of the scientists and everything else. They may want to try to buy a nuke from Pakistan or North Korea, he talks about. So we recognize this idea of nuclear non-proliferation, as worthwhile as it is still difficult. And if you say, well, what's the danger of a nuclear Iran? Just look at the danger that we have of a nuclear Russia, a nuclear China, or even, let's take a small country, a nuclear North Korea. And when you are dealing with what's going on in Iran, especially since they believe there's a 12th Imam by the name of Mahdi that will come back and protect them from any kind of nuclear confrontation, you got to at some point say this is not going to be using deterrence the way we used it during the Cold War.
And, maybe I'm wrong on this and you can correct me if so, Kerby, but I think, even if you are looking at Iran and, there is a lack of rationality there because of the ideology of the leadership, taking this action is still a big signal to the rest of the world.
Yes, it is.
Who might be motivated to sell or not sell any more weapons to Iran, and cutting them off from other, nations who aren't friendly to us, but, who are now questioning whether or not they want to partner with Iran anymore because President Trump has showed that he is willing to take action on what he says. And so I think that that's an important thing to consider, too.
Key issue there is deterrence. For a while they talked about taco. Trump always cops out. Well, I don't think anybody's using the word taco anymore in that regard. But one other issue I thought we would get to, and that is about halfway through the article. And I would really encourage you to read this because this appears on the Dispatch, and you may or may not have a subscription, but we try to provide as much of that online so you can read it for yourself. He says, let's for just a minute think about gun control as it relates to nuclear non-proliferation. And I thought that was a good idea because he says there are people who thinks no one should have guns and there are people who thinks no one should have nuclear weapons. But it isn't the guns or the weapons that are a concern. He says, and I love this line, Kevin Williamson, who we've quoted, and David French, who's been on the program many times, have many guns. This does not bother me in the slightest. France and Israel have nuclear weapons. This doesn't cause me any sleepless nights. And I think that's the important issue here. We may certainly recognize that nuclear weapons are dangerous, and even in hands that are wise, even in allies which we agree with, there's some danger. But the real issue is when you have in the hands of someone who is irrational, someone who has got a trigger finger. That's why, whether we're talking about guns or nuclear weapons, we're never going to get rid of guns. We're never going to get rid of nuclear weapons. You can dream for that utopia. That's not happening. You certainly want to keep it out of the hands of people that threaten you. And when you have a nation and leadership that says death to America all the time, death to Israel all the time, you recognize that this is not a rational group of individuals that will be easily deterred. And so a lot of times people say, well, certainly we could do something to prevent them from wanting to use it, even if they have it. The argument that has been given by presidents, some of whom never acted the way, of course, Donald Trump has, is no, we shouldn't let them have it in the first place. So if you understand how gun control hasn't worked in guns, the idea of trying to have nuclear non-proliferation hasn't worked very well as well, because in some respects people are going to try to get them. But holding a gun to you is dangerous enough. Holding a nuclear weapon can destroy a culture and even a civilization. So that's why I think he really says that we should do kind of a cost-benefit analysis. And if indeed we even see some kind of regime change, which is brought about by individuals rather than trying to force it on us or on them, then maybe that would be a good thing, because after all, Iran is still the number one source of state-sponsored terrorism in the world.
Yeah, I really appreciated the analogy to gun control as well. If you have somebody who has a criminal record or who has a record of domestic violence or aggression towards others, then nobody wants them to be able to get a gun. And they're also not, as he points out, not going to pay attention to signs that say gun-free zone or no guns here. And so he was kind of talking about the process and how when you're talking about a nation like Iran, they're not really following that. And so you have to go to other means and deterrence, which is what I think Trump did correctly.
Let me hold up this booklet. Again, I just mentioned these booklets, one, because we're glad to give them to you free of charge. Simply, as you call in or write in, you can ask for it. We'll send it to you. If you'd like to just get it digitally, we can send it as a PDF, or if you'd like to get it in the mail. This one is a biblical point of view on terrorism. I know we don't tend to think about terrorism very often, but again, I mentioned one on Sharia law. We have one on Islam, of course, one on terrorism. And part of the reason we do that is, Liberty, I know you go to a different church than I do, but I will be honest, I've never heard a pastor ever address the issue of Sharia law or Islam or terrorism or nuclear war or nuclear non-proliferation from the pulpit. That's not appropriate. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody teach about that in a Sunday school class. But if you don't learn about it in church, where are you going to learn about it? And I hope that's one of the reasons why people will support Point of View.
I hope so, too. And this is so important because we don't need to be separating our lives out into, a spiritual realm on Sundays at church and then the secular world the rest of the time. We need to apply a biblical worldview to every single issue that we come across. And that's what Point of View does. And that's what so many people appreciate appreciate about it.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to move on to another topic because we're now 3 years after the Dobbs decision on abortion. I'll give you a preview. Tomorrow, Penna has a commentary on 10 years after the same-sex marriage decision, so we'll be talking about that. But I will also point you to the article we posted yesterday by Victor Davis Hanson, which is entitled 10 Iranian Questions, and trying to maybe make sense of not only the U.S. strikes, but what kind of pressure might come one way or the other from Russia and China. Of course, a lot of that is something we've dealt with in our latest Outlook magazine, which came out in July. And one more time, this is a great opportunity for you to support this ministry. And as Jana mentioned just a minute ago, you can give us a call. Matter of fact, I heard some phones ringing. 1-800-347-5151, 1-800-347-5151. Of course, the website is pointofview.net. We'll take a break, talk about this issue of abortion right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, by the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the things we've posted is a very good piece that came from the editors of National Review, in which they say Dobbs transformed America. What we're talking about, of course, is the decision that came down 3 years ago, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Center, and this is one that overturned Roe versus Wade. And so, first of all, I thought it would be good to maybe maybe reflect on what's happened over the 3 years. But also, once again, I'm going to hold up some booklets, and this one and the one behind it are both by Liberty on the abortion pill. Got one of mine that I created a while back just on how to maybe make the pro-life case. But Liberty, this is a good example of, okay, 3 years later, the question was, well, once the Supreme Court struck down Roe versus Wade, would all the states or most of the states then just have open season on abortion? And you have kind of a mixed situation, and that's why the editors say that it might be time to just begin to rethink the kind of pro-life strategy we're going to have here in the 21st century. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I appreciated this article because as somebody, for whom this issue is close to my heart, I think for many pro-lifers, we zero in on, okay, what's the next step? What do we do now? But it is worth taking a moment to just say, wow, it's been 3 years. I remember the very place that I was in when I saw the notification coming across that Roe had been overturned. And so that was a huge legal victory. And today you have 41 states that have banned or restricted abortion in some way, including 12 states with total bans and 7 states with bans between 6 and 18 weeks. So that's a big victory, something that wouldn't happen in, under Roe versus Wade. But you can say this is a great thing that happened. But what are the challenges now? We celebrate that Roe is overturned, but a lot of abortions, the majority, take place very early on, and now the majority are taking place with the abortion pill. And so the pro-choice side is also changing their strategy. And so now their strategy is to get these pills mailed across state lines where these bans have been enacted and the population doesn't want abortion. And a lot of women are being harmed and taken advantage of in this way. So the fight for life has shifted. So there's a lot of positive, but there's still a lot of work to do.
When I've spoken sometimes at various pregnancy resource center banquets, I talk about the changing agenda of the abortion debate and the changing arena of the abortion debate. The agenda has changed dramatically from a time in which I remember one time I did a debate with a leading abortionist there at the University of Arkansas, in which even though he was doing abortion, said this is kind of the lesser of all evils. These are women who don't want to abort their baby, but they have to because of some crisis. But it was kind of, this is something we just sort of have to make available for a small number of individuals, which turned out not to be the case, as you might know. And now you have Shout My Abortion. So the agenda has changed, and now you've had various states that have tried to enact things that were even more liberal, even more egregious than what you had under Roe versus Wade. I've jokingly said before, so many times people say we need to be more like Europe. But if we were more like Europe, we'd have many more restrictions on abortion in some of these blue states than we do. So the agenda has changed. But as you just alluded to, and that gets you back to your booklet that we just produced again on chemical abortion, the arena has changed. It used to be that if you were pro-life, and we've had various pro-life people on this program, to actually catch or meet with an abortion-minded woman, maybe you could meet her as she was heading to the abortion clinic. Now you'd have to catch her either on the way to her local drugstore or, more importantly, catch her on her way to her mailbox. And so this whole chemical abortion debate has changed everything, hasn't it?
It has. And this is why the cultural groundwork, I think, is so critical. And so, there are organizations like Human Coalition, which Chelsea Yeoman works for, and they do catch women online. And if a woman is looking, researching an abortion online, then she can get connected with a nurse at Human Coalition. And oftentimes they find out that she just needs support. And she is thankful for the opportunity to know that she can get the support she needs to have her baby. But on the other hand, there's so much misinformation about the abortion pill young girls and young women are told that it's safe. It's just like taking a Tylenol.
Wow.
And in reality, it's causing women to go to the hospital. You have doctors, or not even doctors, but people prescribing it online over things like Zoom when they can't verify how far along the woman is or whether she's having an ectopic pregnancy. And then these can obviously cause devastating complications. So it's definitely worth ask about the booklet, share it with people that you know, because I think we really do, like you said, we can't necessarily do as much in front of the clinics anymore, but you can preemptively educate people, educate your kids, educate their peer groups, because I've heard from people I know. This is happening in high schools here in Texas, right around where we live, in high school bathrooms. And these teenage girls are being lied to, and they need somebody to speak the truth to them and educate them before they're in that situation.
One of the things I always like to recommend is that if you work in a pregnancy resource center, you might order some of these on chemical abortion. These little booklets are very easy to read. People recognize that most of them can be read in about 10 minutes. Now, yours goes into a little more detail, so it might take 15 minutes, but that's okay. And then it has resources at the end, because some people might say, well, where did that come from? Or how can I find that? And of course, you've got everything from CareNet to Heartbeat International, Human Coalition, a variety of others that are there as well. So again, this is one of those resources we would want to give to you individually. We'd also like to give it to you as a church or pregnancy center, because we certainly want to stand for life. And I think it's a good illustration of that. But let me make one political comment, because this article also reminds us that in the first election after the Dobbs decision, Republicans regained control of the House. Every pro-life incumbent won in the Senate and governor's races, with a latter group including people who signed on to law major protections for the unborn. The argument always is, well, once this now is put to a vote, and there were some special votes which did not go in the pro-life direction, but when people had a chance to evaluate a candidate on a number of issues, being pro-life was not a negative. In many cases, it was a positive, and I think we'll continue to see that. And really, still, the younger you are, the more likely you are to be pro-life, aren't you?
Yeah, no, I think that's, the pro-choice side, the pro-abortion side is going to say that people favor abortion without restrictions, but that's just not true. And again, I think a lot of people are thinking about those special circumstances where they feel like women aren't going to have any other option. And as a pro-lifer, I would say there's always another option. But the reality is most people don't want abortion to be legal all the way through pregnancy in any circumstance. And so they are in favor of some restrictions, and people who make abortion without any limit their sole source of messaging, that's just not very attractive to people.
Let's take a break. But just before we do so, if you say, well, I appreciate the fact you're taking a stand for life. As we've pointed out before, sometimes when we take a stand for Israel, we lose donors. When we take a stand for life, sometimes we do as well. So if you are one who believes in what we are doing to educate people about the abortion pill, about abortion, about pro-life issues, and many other things, let me again, as we go to a break, suggest that you might want to give us a call. That number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Of course, the website is pointofview.net. There's a button there that you can click on, and that button simply says Give Now, and your gift, whether it's a one-time gift or a monthly gift, will be doubled, because, as we've said, we still have quite a bit of match money on the table. So we need to hear from you. When we come back from the break, Dr. Jeff Myers will talk with us about his book, Should Christians Support Israel? We'll talk about that with him right after this.
Imagine this. Your child comes home from school and says, is it hateful to tell people they can't change genders? Or how about, why are Israel and Palestine at war? How would you answer? Our children and grandchildren encounter big questions on tough issues every day, especially in an age of constant online access. We must be prepared to articulate a biblical worldview on these issues, and that is where you come in. By supporting Point of View, you equip real people to answer the tough questions. So many listeners say Point of View helps them discuss important issues with their loved ones. Point of View needs your support by June 30th. And if you give by then, your gift will be doubled by a matching challenge. Give now and help anchor Americans to truth by visiting pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net, 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, we have in studio with us Liberty McArtor, and now we're going to be talking with our good friend Dr. Jeff Myers. This book has been out for some time, but we thought it would be very good to talk about should Christians support Israel, seeking a biblical worldview in an impossible situation. Dr. Jeff Myers, certainly familiar to those of you that listen to Point of View, author of 14 books, including the book Understanding the Times, has his Doctor of Philosophy degree from the University of Denver, of course, was at various institutions of education, including Bryan College. Of course, he is the president of Summit Ministries, and we have a link to summit.org. But also, if you're interested in this book, we have a link in case you would like to find it either in paperback or Kindle. And Jeff, it is great to welcome you back to Point of View.
Kerby, thank you. Could not be a more timely conversation than at this point, at this moment.
You know, I was on with Michael Easley earlier today, and he said, well, we have Jeff Myers on a regular basis, and so we got talking about how good you are in terms of all these issues and education. But this book is, again, about 160 pages, 13 chapters, why you should care about Israel and the battle of worldviews and finding solutions from a biblical worldview. And I've told people in the past, and I think this is right, that one of the reasons you wrote the book is you were seeing more and more of your students show up in student conferences there at Summit and other places where they're saying, I don't know if we should support the nation of Israel, and you felt the need to write this book.
That's exactly right. There is a big gap here. It's not between the coastal elites and the people in the middle of America. It's a generational gap. Older people generally say they support Israel. Younger people generally say they do not. And after the October 7th terrorist attacks in 2023, where Hamas raped and mutilated and tortured 1,000 Israelis and then took hundreds more captive, 60% of young adults say they thought Hamas's aims were just. And I couldn't believe it. I ended up writing an opinion editorial piece for the Daily Wire. Congratulations, America. You've raised a generation of terrorist sympathizers, which obviously was provocative and got a lot of attention, positive and negative. But it led to the opportunity to actually go to see firsthand, to go to the war, to spend time with people who were, Arabs as well as Jews, Muslims, non-believers, IDF soldiers, all kinds of people in between, to find out what was really going on and to ask all of the hard questions that I knew my students were asking about genocide and a just war and all of those kinds of things. And this book just sort of popped out of that. I knew I had to write it because I knew we had to protect this rising generation from not only anti-Israel propaganda, but anti-American propaganda.
Jeff, this is Liberty McArtor, and thank you so much for this book. I would recommend it to any person, especially young adult, who wants to understand this issue. But one of the things that you talk about is the issue of worldview, and people might not initially connect that with the kind of Israel controversy, but really there is this underlying worldview that even a lot of young Christians I've seen in my circles, kind of millennials and Gen Z, who have fallen into this worldview that really morality is divided into different classes of oppressed versus oppressor. And I think that that's what is impacting so many people's perception of the Israel conflict. So could you explain that for us a little bit?
I'd be happy to. We, at Summit Ministries, we define a worldview as a pattern of ideas, beliefs, convictions, and habits that help us make sense of God and the world and our relationship to God and the world. That key word is the word patterns. What you believe about God will determine what you believe about reality itself, what you believe about what's right or wrong, what you think makes a good society, politically, economically, and legally. So we are seeing a major worldview battle right now where young adults have, in essence, rejected a biblical view of the world that says that God is creator, that society is put together in such a way that God's purposes are achieved, and that we want to move people toward blessing and flourishing. And it's instead largely based on their education in leftist schools, taken on a perspective that America is evil, that it's a colonialist state. It needs to be torn down. All private property needs to be seized, turned over to a government authority and run by socialists to move toward a communist worldview. And it's shocking to think that young adults find this attractive, but 70% of millennials said they would vote for a socialist to be president of the United States. In New York City, Zoran Mandami just won the Democratic nomination to be the candidate for mayor in that city. He is a far, far left socialist Islamist. And so essentially when it comes to Israel, I think people would benefit from not thinking about this just as a geopolitical conflict where it's over some boundaries and a little bit of land here and there, and instead think of it as a theopolitical conflict. If you don't understand the nature of radical Islam, you can't understand why the Iranians are doing what they're doing or any of the other groups in that region.
And again, you have a whole section there about what is Islam and what is Hamas. But just on a positive note, before we get into some of that, you have a whole chapter which I thought was very helpful, the Israel you haven't heard about. And that's one of the things we like to talk about here on Point of View, some of the stories that don't get covered by the mainstream press, since they're, especially in this case, tends to be more of an anti-Israel bias. And one of your chapters reminds us there's a lot of positive things that comes out of Israel.
Oh, yeah. And there's even more than I could put into the pages of the book. But let me say this. When you look at all of the nations in the Middle East, Israel stands alone as a democracy. There is no comparison between the worldview of Israel and the worldview of Iran. Iran is a dictatorship. It hates women. It provides no room for people for religious diversity. It provides no room for people who are LGBTQ or others who are minority populations, whereas Israel is a very vibrant democracy. Maybe some people think too vibrant. They have 55 political parties in Israel for 9 million people.
Yes.
15 of those political parties have seats in the Knesset, which is their legislature, and they debate. They really argue things out. They talk it through, they think it through, and then they figure out what is in the best interest of their nation. That, I believe, is powerful and stands alone. And that kind of governmental system has led to an economic system that's promoted tremendous prosperity. I would say, this is from the economist George Gilder, about 25% of the technological innovations that have created wealth in the United States of America for everyday people came from Israel.
Yes.
Israel is America's R&D lab.
Yes. And again, we've talked with him about that. And again, when you even talk about the Knesset, one of the parties certainly represents Arabs. So Arabs have more freedom in Israel than Arabs have in other Arab countries. And Arabs have a lot more freedom in Israel than Jews have in any other country. So it's just an illustration of that. So let's take a break. And when we come back, there are many chapters in this book, but we want to get into it a little bit more. Liberty McArtor with us. And of course, we're talking by phone with Dr. Jeff Myers. If you say, okay, I'd like to get a copy of that book, we have that link on our website. And you can scroll down under his picture and find that. Of course, you can also go to summit.org to find out more about the student conferences and other resources available at Summit Ministries. And we'll continue our conversation with Jeff Myers right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
For decades, the left has been willing to redefine terms to win a debate and convince the public of their views. Tomorrow, I will provide some examples of that linguistic sleight of hand, but today I want to talk about a new strategy. Leftists claim the word woke and wokeness cannot be defined since so many politicians and commentators are using the terms in a negative way. Are some people using the term woke without understanding what it means? That's inevitable in a world where people are misusing terms like racism and white supremacy as epithets. To counter some of the misunderstanding, I devote the beginning section of my book, A Biblical Point of View on Wokeness, to explain what woke is not. You can find a complete list in the book, Christianity and Wokeness by Owen Strachan. Defining what woke isn't difficult. Wilfred Riley recently wrote How to Define Woke. He says that the woke person or the social justice warrior is someone who believes that, number one, the institutions of American society are currently and intentionally set up to oppress minorities, women, and the poor. Number two, virtually all gaps in performance between large groups prove that this oppression exists. And number three, the solution to this is equity, which means proportional representation regardless of performance or qualifications. He also provides an excellent definition of woke from James Lindsay, who I've quoted in previous commentaries. Riley also explains that these definitions are not ones that conservative authors have created. Essentially, they are merely summaries of the writings of leftists who have been promoting wokeness and critical theory for the last few decades. He concludes by noting that sometimes woke policies can be complex to discuss, but they aren't hard to define. Don't stop using a word that is accurate and descriptive. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes. Should Christians support Israel is the title of the book. You might be asking as well, since we're coming to fiscal year end, if I support Point of View, will I get this kind of information in the mail? And I'll hold up just a couple. Here's a booklet I did on a biblical point of view on Israel, some biblical point of view booklets we've done in the past on anti-Semitism, which relates very much to this. In studio with me today is Liberty McArtor, and I know you had a question for, again, Dr. Jeff Myers.
Yes, Jeff, one of the things you illustrate in your book is how effective Hamas propaganda is. And that's one of the big reasons that we are seeing so many young people even supporting Hamas, which can be mind-blowing, but they are understandably sympathetic with the plight of many Gazans who are, trapped in between this conflict. But what they don't realize is that Hamas is actually harming their own people, but they're not getting that information because Hamas is also so effective at lying and spreading disinformation.
There's no question. When you see people protesting in the streets, chanting things like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, it's not because they know what river and what sea they're talking about. At least half of those polled have no idea what river and sea they're talking about. They're just embracing slogans that have been given to them by this group called Hamas. This is a terrorist group. It was designated as a terrorist group by the United States government in 1997. They have controlled the Gaza territory since 2006. They do not allow for free speech. They do not allow for freedom of viewpoint. They persecute Christians as well as anybody else who disagrees with them, and have basically almost completely pushed Christians out of the Gaza territory. And they have as their core doctrine the elimination of the state of Israel and the killing of all Jews. Now, you don't have to take my word for this. They've actually put out, they don't lie about this. They put right out there, this is what we intend to do. They've produced a charter. They had one in the late 1990s. They did another one in 2017 to say exactly what they intend to do and exactly how they intend to do it. The tie-in to the current news, Liberty, I think is really interesting. 93% of Hamas's funding comes from Iran because they share a similar goal, which is the elimination of the state of Israel. So, yes, Hamas is very good at this. What they've been especially good at, and this really, as I work with young adults, it has really bothered a lot of them. They are really good at playing into some of the Marxist rhetoric that young adults find compelling. And Liberty, earlier you mentioned the oppressor versus oppressed viewpoint. This is called colonialism. Now, as far as a Marxist is concerned, anything that tears down modern, what they think of as evil capitalist society, is good. So if people are concerned about capitalism, then you can use that as a bad word. If they aren't concerned about that, you can use words like patriarchy as the bad word. That's the reason to tear down America. But many people have started to use this word colonialism. They say that America is a colonialist settler nation, that Israel is a colonialist settler nation. This simply is in complete contradiction to the truth of history. Every single nation in the world is now run by people who were not the original settlers who lived there. That, except for Israel, actually, believe it or not, but all of the other nations of the world are colonialist in this way. What makes Israel uniquely bad? And if you talk to the people who are involved, they say, well, look, we're Americans. We feel terrible that America was able to establish itself, and we don't really think that it can be overthrown very easily. But Israel, they're smaller. They're across the ocean, and it's just a bunch of Jewish people. So who really cares? Let's tear that down, and then we will feel better about our own colonialist project in the United States of America. So it's this really bizarre offsetting of, trying to find some kind of a public form of absolution for what they think of as the sins of capitalism by tackling Israel.
Wow.
Well said. Again, Hamas, as you point out, is, if you will, like a death cult. But I thought just before we run out of time, since you have chapters dealing with propaganda, one of the key ones, and you've actually devoted a chapter, charges of genocide. That's where I begin to run into the claims of what Israel is doing. I think if you have an open mind at all, you will see that that's fallacious, but you've devoted a chapter to it, so how do we respond?
This is the number one question asked by the young adults I work with today. Even this last week, I had a Jewish friend who was in town. I did a Q&A with her. I told her the very first question is going to be about genocide. Sure enough, it was, because these students feel safe to ask good questions. What is genocide? Genocide is the intentional elimination of a people group as a group. The United Nations has put together the International Court of Justice. They are the ones that define what genocide is from an international standpoint, and they have refused to do so when it comes to Israel. It's fascinating. They're as anti-Israel as they can be, but they have refrained from accusing Israel of genocide. Why? Well, America's leading expert on this topic, a guy named John Spencer, about protecting civilians in a time of war. He points out that in a typical urban warfare situation, 9 civilians are killed for every 1 combatant killed. Israel, because of its very strict rules of engagement, has kept that down to 1 civilian killed for every Hamas fighter killed. Now, all civilian deaths are a tragedy in a time of war. But what Israel has done has preserved human life and dignity more than any other nation, according to John Spencer, even the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the charges of genocide are a political charge by people who want to tear down Israel, ultimately want to tear down the United States of America. We should be concerned about suffering people, and we should figure out ways to help them. But destroying the state of Israel is the worst possible way to go about doing that.
Just before I let you go, one of the things we are doing is, of course, as we come to our fiscal year end, encouraging people to support Point of View. And, of course, we would encourage people to also support what you do at Summit Ministries. But any thoughts about that? Because we certainly, over the last couple of days, we did a program yesterday about, of course, the prophetic implications of it. We've done this one with you today on that. We spent some time talking about some of the back and forth about whether or not this attack by the United States was devastating to Iran, and I think we can prove that it was. But what would you say to people that are thinking about supporting this ministry?
I am happy to add my voice to those who are saying that Point of View is worthy of your financial support. Your program every single day tackles the toughest issues of our time and does so from a biblical viewpoint. Now, there are a lot of other programs out there that tackle issues from maybe a conservative viewpoint or what have you. But from a biblical viewpoint, that is very rare. And I'm very excited about what you're doing there. And I think the financial partners who help make that happen are investing in something that is worthy, because we need to be people who understand the times and know what America ought to do.
Let's, if we can, also encourage people to go to summit.org. Of course, I've mentioned the student conferences, and I've been able to join with that, and we've always promoted that as well. But there are all sorts of resources, including many of your books. Of course, I would highlight Understanding the Times, Understanding the Faith, Understanding the Culture, to mention just a few. A while back, your particular book on the topic of truth was one that we made available to our major donors, because we thought that particular book was so essential and so key. Truth changes everything. So we always are very supportive of what you do at Jeff and at Summit Ministries. But when people land at the website, talk about how they can sign up and learn more about what you're doing.
You can find out about the student conferences that we have for young adults who are 16 to 22. Absolutely transformational in their lives. You have talked about this on your show, that only 1% of young adults in the United States of America today have a biblical worldview. By the time they finish our 12-day program, 95% say they have a biblical worldview. And we continue surveying them throughout their lives, 1 year after they've gone through the program, 5 years after, 10 years after, even 10 years later. 85% say they are staying strong in a biblical worldview. So it is not inevitable that a young adult will walk away from their faith and reject God. You can train them to take every thought captive, to not be taken captive by hollow and deceptive philosophies, and in a way to really be civil about it by setting the captives free, to learn how to teach and communicate truth in a relational way, yes, so that it makes sense to people of our time.
Again, don't be taken captive, Colossians 2:8, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind in Christ Jesus. Again, I might recommend his book, Truth Changes Everything. And, of course, this book, Should Christians Support Israel? We have information about Summit Ministries. We have information about the book. But as we go to a break, might be a good time to give us a call. 800-347-5151. That's 800-347-5151. We'll be back right after this.
Well, I do need to say that we are running out of time to raise funds by June 30th, the deadline that will determine our budget for the next fiscal year. Your gift will make a difference. And thanks to an ongoing matching challenge, your gift will be doubled through the month of June. Here's why Point of View is the media ministry to support as we forge into the future. Point of View is trustworthy, with proven dedication to a biblical worldview for 53 years and counting. Additionally, Point of View is making a multi-generational impact. Your support equips listeners to articulate biblical truth about the issues of our day with their children and even their grandchildren. Americans need a proven resource to equip current and future generations to live out God's truth in our time. Give it to them today by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we've got about a half an hour before the program ends today. And of course, as we've said before, there really is a sense of urgency. We have match money on the table. We've jokingly said before, if we put money on the table and then walked away and didn't actually pick it up, we would think something was wrong. So obviously, if you've been saying, well, I'm waiting for the last day or two, well, that has come. And if you would want to join with us, feel free to go to the website at pointofview.net. We did talk about Israel, and I thought I'd hold this up again. This is one of the booklets. And lots of times people say, well, if I support you, I appreciate that. But we have made the case, and Jana Weidler, will bring her in again a little bit later, talks about we see you as a partner. We really want to give you material that will help you make the case. And if you find yourself saying, well, I would like to know a little bit more about Israel, I'd like to know how to maybe respond to some of the questions about Hamas or anti-Semitism or Israel, those resources are available, and we send those out on a regular basis. If you join with us on the Truth Team, $1 a day, $30 a month, you'll receive those booklets. And the one I just mentioned a minute ago having to do with the issue of Sharia law is the latest one. And of course, we have the Outlook magazine going out to those of you who are donors. So whether you make a one-time gift or a monthly gift, let me encourage you to go to the website and find out a little bit more. I thought, Liberty, I'd pick up something for just a minute, hold up my booklet on socialism, because I heard that this was a possibility, but there was a sense in my back of my mind thinking, so many times you hear me say common sense is breaking out all over the place. Apparently not for the Democratic voters in the state of New York. Zohran Mamdani, first of all, this is an interesting combination, a Marxist, or, I guess you could call him Marxist or a communist or a socialist, whatever you want to say. He really has a Marxist philosophy. But if you want to call him a socialist, fine. He was endorsed, of course, by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Bernie Sanders, who are, of course, individuals who call themselves socialists. But he also is a Muslim, so he could be New York City's first Muslim Marxist mayor. Now, you might say, well, that's what you call him. What does he stand for? Okay, I'm reading now from his platform summary. $30 per hour minimum wage, a freeze on any rents in the state of New York, but certainly he could only control the city of New York, but he'd like to get that done. Government-run grocery stores. If you've had some difficulty finding food in, I know you like H-E-B.
Yes.
Just imagine what it'd be like if you have the Department of Motor Vehicles, a DMV, running your grocery store, free buses. I don't know how we pay for this. Free childcare. Not sure how we pay this. He wants to create a Department of Community Safety, which would then be there instead of the police. And then, as we're going to talk about in just a minute, when we talk about the war on children, he wants to provide additional protections for transgender surgeries, what's called gender-affirming care. And how's he going to pay for this? Maximum and really massive tax increases on businesses. And don't you think some of them just might take a hike from New York City? So that's the platform. Go to his website, read it for yourself, Zohran Mamdani. And of course, this is only a primary. It's quite possible he could lose, but he won the Democratic primary. When's the last time a Republican ran and won in New York City? That'd be Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and that was a long, long time ago. So it is quite possible he could be the first Muslim Marxist mayor in New York City. And so even though I like to say common sense is breaking out all over the place, it hasn't reached New York City.
Yeah, well, everybody else is building up around where we are in Texas right now. We may be seeing some more businesses heading our way soon.
I know. Again, as we say before, you really just can't make some of this up. But nevertheless, one of the other things we did talk about, let me again encourage those of you, even as you make your gift today, say, I'd like to get a copy of the very good and very well-written article and booklet by Libby McArtor, and that is the case as well. But just before we wind down today, we've talked about the assault on the unborn, but this one comes from our friend John Stossel, The War on Children, and he's really talking about Robbie Starbuck. Now, if you've been following him, he's an individual, and I'm not into this as much as maybe your generation is, but nevertheless, he directed music videos for Snoop Dogg and Natalie Portman and things like that. In this interview, John Stossel reminds him of one of the lyrics from Snoop Dogg, which I will not read on the air, but think the worst and you can get to this. And so all of a sudden, Robbie Starbuck and I'm not even sure that's his original name, nevertheless said, I began to see how negative this was having, and all it takes is for you to be a mom or a dad. In this case, he became a dad, and when his daughter came home and talked about white privilege and all sorts of other things, he began to recognize what was happening. And he is one of those individuals, interestingly enough, who has been able to change some of the woke policies that many of these companies have. But then his new movie, which originally was banned on Amazon Prime, it was banned on TikTok. Well, it has to be pretty bad to be banned on TikTok. But nevertheless, it was. Nevertheless, now I think they've relented, so you can watch it. But one of the things he's talking about gets back to our booklet on transgenderism. And I thought it was relevant that one of the things that is part of the platform for the newly confirmed, at least on the Democratic Party side, for the mayor's election in New York City, Zohran Mamdani, is this idea of gender affirming research and surgery and all the rest. And so he is very concerned about the fact that TikTok, he says, has really taken the time to confuse children about their gender. And as a result, he's been very concerned about what's happening in this whole issue of transgenderism.
Well, you know, Kerby, I actually don't follow Robbie Starbuck. I had to look him up and remind myself, well, yeah, I've seen that name around. But reading the article that you posted, I have to say I agree with what he was saying. And yes, as the author of the article initially said, maybe there was some skepticism. Really? A war on children? But just the amount of reading and research that I've been doing lately on so the tech battle, social media algorithms, how those are impacting kids. There really is a war for the minds and hearts of children. And one of the notes in the article, the author asked the question, well, I look on, a TikTok page, or I open up the app and I don't see all of these, videos pushing that kind of ideology toward me. And parents have said the same thing. But these algorithms know when there are kids on the platform, and it's a completely different interface. I just read a book called The Tech Exit by Claire Morrell, which is excellent. And she said parents were not really concerned about their kids having Snapchat because when they had an account, there was really nothing bad on there. She said, go look at your kid's account. So they opened up their kid's account and they were absolutely shocked and devastated by what they were seeing and said that they got their kids off immediately. And so there is a lot of just explicit, dangerous information that is being pushed into kids' minds through technology, including things like, gender ideology. Social contagion is a factor. And one of the biggest questions that Gen Z has is about identity. How do I find my identity? So they're very vulnerable in this area, and you have an ideology that's pretending to answer that question for them. So I think it's a great article. People should check it out, and then some of the resources that we mentioned on Point of View as well for that.
And again, let me just mention that John Stossel comes as a sort of a libertarian, so it's kind of like, well, I don't really have a problem with that. Well, we're not trying to necessarily tell every parent how to raise their kids, but we also want to warn them, as you just did, that you might look at your kid's TikTok feed, or you might get it and say, well, it looks good to me, but it's different to your children than it is to you. And so that's the key issue. Second of all, this particular documentary called The War on Children, when it was on X, it was even endorsed by people like Elon Musk and had over 30 million views. But here's a good illustration. It was banned on Amazon Prime, was also banned on TikTok, but it looks like Amazon has changed their mind, recognizing that maybe the winds are blowing a little different in terms of this woke ideology, in terms of this issue of transgenderism. And once again, let me just say that common sense is breaking out when you've got this individual that is best known for working with Smashing Pumpkins and Yellow Card and Snoop Dogg and Natalie Portman, to mention just a few, is now saying, I got kids. I'm a little more concerned about this now, and put together that documentary, but also is the person that's been behind some of those times when they've gone to shareholder meetings and issued resolutions calling for these Fortune 500 companies to maybe give up their woke ideology. So here's just one more example, and you can kind of see the counterpoint from kind of a libertarian and an individual who probably couldn't sign the doctrinal statement of your church, but nevertheless says, this is of concern, and that's why I produced that documentary. It's on Point of View, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for just a few more minutes. Let me just mention that last article is by John Stossel. You can watch the video. You can see a little bit more about Robbie Starbuck. And again, didn't think I'd be necessarily endorsing something like that, but that particular The War on Children documentary came out before, had an incredible number of views, and now, interesting enough, Amazon Prime has said, okay, maybe we'll play it there as well. You could get it on X, and I just thought it would be an illustration. But Liberty, just before we go to some of the comments we're going to make before the end of the program, there's really two issues. Number one, it is, of course, the content that comes, as he was talking about, in terms of TikTok and how the algorithm really will give your children or your grandchildren different kinds of videos and clicks and connections than maybe you. So you could get on TikTok and say, looks okay to me. Just looks like kids playing volleyball, kittens, all sorts of stuff, maybe family reunion. And then you get your kids and go, whoa, wait a minute. This is like R-rated stuff. So that's the first thing. But there's a bigger issue, which you've talked about on the Know Why podcast, and that is we have whole generation looking at these screens. And this morning, again, I was on a program where we talked about neuroplasticity. It's retraining your brains. So I think a wise parent, as you are, raising your kids, or a grandparent should really reevaluate the amount of time your kids or grandkids spend in front of a screen.
Yeah, and you know what, Kerby, it goes back to kind of full circle what we talked about at the beginning of the show of being able to think through an issue. We already know that our attention spans are shorter because we're watching so many short form videos on social media, but it's actually affecting kids' mental stamina as they develop to be able to think through an argument all the way to its end. And so it's not as surprising when you think about it that way that when you do have something like, Hamas propaganda or even, radical gender ideology come across their screen and it's a compelling story and it's told in a convincing way, that they're going to be convinced by it because that is how they've been trained to think. So I encourage people, check out Know Why Podcast. It's one of the resources we offer at Point of View, and I've been talking a lot about AI, social media, and tech lately, so there are some good resources for parents there.
That's another one, too. Be aware of AI and where that comes from. The old phrase, and I used it many times when I was programming computers during graduate school, garbage in, garbage out. So where is it getting that information? And that's why you need a great deal of discernment. I thought just before we wind down today, though, of course, Liberty, we also want to bring back Jana Weidler, who is the Vice President of Stewardship, and we've encouraged people to give because we have a match on the table. And how are we doing?
We do. We have that wonderful match, and I'm so pleased to report that we just received $5,000 worth of gifts in the last hour. We got a $100 gift from Steve in Lufkin, a $350 gift from Jay in Farmington, New Mexico, and Mary from Swainsboro called in with a gift of $30. So I want to let our listeners know that even though the show is going to end in the next few minutes, our phone lines will be open until 8 p.m. Central Time. You can call 1-800-347-5151, or you can go online to pointofview.net and just click on that giving button. We would appreciate it so much, and we're already so blessed by the gifts coming in, but boy, we sure need some help.
Let me give you a preview for tomorrow. We'll have Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford sitting here. We're going to be talking about a case that may go to the Supreme Court that they have been involved with. We'll talk about this one federal judge, Liberty in Massachusetts, where the Supreme Court rules, and he says, well, I'm just going to ignore the Supreme Court. And even the Supreme Court, even the liberal justices on the Supreme Court go, what? I mean, have you lost your mind? And so we'll get into that. We'll actually hear some of the things that were said by the Iranian supreme leader, because some people say, well, maybe they've changed their mind. Well, maybe he hasn't, but I think some of the other people have. We'll also get into if we really wanted to cut the budget through Doge, how can that be done? And Penna Dexter has a piece on Obergefell 10 years later, just as we talked about 3 years after Dobbs, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. We also have now Penna writing a piece which we'll talk about tomorrow, 10 years after the, if you will, legalization of same-sex marriage. And I was just thinking that so often, Jana, when we go out and meet people all over the country, they say, I just appreciate Point of View because you're my lifeline. I hear things on Point of View that I frankly would not know about if I didn't tune into this program.
That is true. That is true. You, Kerby, are the voice that people trust. And you do your homework. You are well-informed. And being able to share biblical clarity on these subjects is so important. So, yes, that's what we do, and we need support to do it. So please call in. Again, 1-800-347-5151.
I think about just the amount of booklets that you held up in today's program, and just ranging from things about Israel to the chemical abortion and gender ideology. And that's just one tiny sample of the big stack of booklets that you've got over there. And those are the kinds of issues that you talk about every single day, and offering a biblical worldview on. So I think just the breadth of issues covered, but also covered deeply and carefully is what I appreciate. When I'm not in the office, I'm always listening because I'm still learning from the program myself.
Yes, and people do love those booklets, don't they, Jana?
Yes, they do. And if you are a listener and you have gotten one of the booklets and you want to share it with your Bible study or college and career or youth group, please give us a call. We can send you some extra copies. We need to get the word out. We need to get the truth out.
Yes. And again, you might want to contact Jana because that is the way in which we get those out. And so many times we've seen situations where, do you have a few extra copies of this? Because I know some people I want to give it to right now. I was hearing that some of the individuals that we were even with yesterday say, well, sometimes I take the Outlook magazine on an airplane and I'll just put it with the other magazines there, knowing somebody else will pull it
Smart.
out. Or I've been in dentist's office where I'll see my booklets laid out there so that other people can read them as well. So this can have a multiplier effect, and that's, of course, what we want to do. Yes. We want to equip you. Jana, you talk so often about these are our partners, right?
Yes.
And we certainly want to partner with you so that you can take this and pass it on to others. We can certainly talk about the more than 200 radio stations that we broadcast on, or the more than 600 radio stations that carry my commentary. But if those individuals pass it on to 2 or 3 others, just think of the kind of impact that we can have. So the number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. But Jana, you were saying that even though we're going off the air right now, they can still make that phone call, can't they?
They can. Our lines, again, will be open until 8 o'clock Central Time. And if it's more convenient for you to give online, go to pointofview.net and hit that donate button.
So first of all, Liberty, let's again mention that you can also go to the Know Why podcast, and we need to find some natural links there. I think if we click under your picture, we can get that as well. But if we don't, we need to let people know how. Yeah, that certainly will take to the knowwhypodcast.com. The most recent one, Coping with Fear and Anxiety Amidst some of the issues in the world. And we talked about one of the questions people are asking is, how can I cope with that? And in my broadcast this morning, that came up. And so I did mention your Know Why podcast. So 2 assignments for you. First of all, if you can support this ministry, click on that button that says support this organization, Anchor to Truth, give now. But number 2, you can also find the link to the Know Why podcast, and you'd be thrilled if more people would sign up to receive that.
Absolutely. It's a great resource to listen to and share.
And so, again, that's all we have for today. First of all, I want to thank Megan for engineering the program behind the scenes. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Jana and Liberty, it's been great to have you in studio. We look forward tomorrow. We'll have Kelly Shackelford, Penedexter in studio. We look forward to seeing you right then here on Point of View.
Imagine this. Your child comes home from school and says, is it hateful to tell people they can't change genders? Or how about, why are Israel and Palestine at war? How would you answer? Our children and grandchildren encounter big questions on tough issues every day, especially in an age of constant online access. We must be prepared to articulate a biblical worldview on these issues. And that is where you come in. By supporting Point of View, you equip real people to answer the tough questions. So many listeners say Point of View helps them discuss important issues with their loved ones. Point of View needs your support by June 30th. And if you give by then, your gift will be doubled by a matching challenge. Give now and help anchor Americans to truth by visiting pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net, 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.